wonderful to see everyone here this evening. Thanks for coming. Since we have a presumably friendly audience, I don't think I need to convince anyone here about how wrong U.S. policy is toward Israel and the Palestinian people. So I'll give an informal, maybe half-hour talk, and then we can really open it up for more of a conversation that I usually do at these type of events. I want to start my remarks by recognizing that the 20th century witnessed the resolution of many historical conflicts that were deemed complicated, complex, emotionally fraught, and laden with different historical claims. So whether we're talking about the decolonization of Algeria, the end of apartheid in South Africa, power sharing in Northern Ireland, all of these difficult and long-standing conflicts were resolved in the 20th century. And why were they? The reason was because the political will to resolve them was there before the negotiations began. So for example, if we're talking about Algeria, for 7 years there was a brutal war between France and the FLN, the Front Libération Nationale, for the decolonization and independence of Algeria. And in the course of this war, France killed more than 1 million Algerian Muslims. And for 130 years, France had colonized and occupied and even annexed. Algeria was part of France, in France's estimation. And despite all of this horrific history and this terrible bloodshed experienced by Algerians, when Charles de Gaulle, the French premier, stood up and said in 1961 to the French people that France should be for the French people and Algeria should be for the Algerian people, the FLN came to the table and negotiated a peace deal within 1 year that resulted in the decolonization and independence of Algeria. With South Africa, you had a legacy of 350 years of racial discrimination against the 90% of South Africans who are black. And you have 40 plus years of institutionalized racism known as apartheid in South Africa. Yet after South Africa had become an international pariah because of the BDS movement back then, when South Africa decided that it had to negotiate an end of apartheid in order to be readmitted to the community of nations and remove itself from being an international pariah, when that decision was made, they sat down and they negotiated with the ANC, the African National Congress, and despite 350 years of oppression, they were able to resolve this conflict in 3 years. And in year number 4, Nelson Mandela was elected South Africa's first democratic president. Similarly, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 ended more than 800 years of communal conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland based on a power-sharing arrangement after all sides had come to the table to renounce violence and to agree upon a political framework for resolving their conflicts. So why do I bring these up? As you all are probably well aware, people who are invested in what I call the peace process industry like to tell us that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so difficult to understand and so complex, and that if you don't have the specialized insider knowledge that they have, then you can't even begin to understand what this is all about. Well, I don't think it's complicated. I think it's a situation of apartheid. In all of historic Palestine, Israel controls 100% of the land, and Palestinians either have little or no rights based on where they live. And the problem with this peace process is that it has failed because the political will to end these apartheid policies has not been there on the part of Israel. The reverse has been true. The peace process has been premised on the notion that Israel should retain its apartheid policies toward the Palestinians, that the peace process should be used as a pretext for the advancing of Israel's colonization of the occupied Palestinian territories. This is why the peace process has failed, because unlike South Africa, unlike Northern Ireland, unlike Algeria, in this case, not all the parties have come to the table with a true intent to resolve the conflict on a just basis. The second reason I raise this is because, as many of you know, 20 years ago last month marked the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO. This was supposed to have set in motion a process that would have led to the signing of an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement in 5 years' time. And what was supposed to have happened as part of this process was that in year 3, the parties were supposed to sit down and negotiate all of the, quote, permanent status issues that lay at the crux of this conflict, the fate of Palestinian refugees, Jerusalem, borders, water, etc. The problem was that Israel, instead of actually sitting down to negotiate about these issues, dragged out these interim phases of the process interminably in order to continue an unprecedented expansion of its colonization efforts on Palestinian land. And this was a situation that obtained all the way up until Camp David in 2000, when the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Barak, asked President Bill Clinton to convene a summit meeting to try to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in one fell swoop. Now, when the PLO chair, Yasser Arafat, got the invitation to come to Camp David, he said, we haven't done the preliminary legwork that's necessary. Remember, these negotiations were supposed to begin in year 3 of the process on all of these issues, and they hadn't even started. Camp David was like year 6 of the process. And so none of the preliminary negotiation had even taken place. And as you study international diplomacy, you realize that heads of states don't come together to negotiate peace treaties. Heads of state come together after the experts have done the work, narrowed the gaps, and then they come to cross the T's and dot the I's on the agreement. So none of this work had been done. And Arafat said to Clinton, this summit can't possibly succeed without this work having been done. But Clinton said, don't worry, if it doesn't work, nobody will be blamed. So Arafat went to Camp David, they sat down and negotiated for 2 weeks. A so-called generous offer was presented to the Palestinians, where there was actually no map presented to the Palestinians. There would be no Palestinian sovereignty in Jerusalem, and of course, no right of Palestinian refugees to return. So what Arafat told Clinton was this, and this is a direct quote: if I sign this, I will go back home and I'll be assassinated. Because Camp David would have been a selling out of Palestinian individual and collective rights. So the negotiations broke down in failure, and Clinton stood up 1 hour after the failure of these negotiations, and he blamed Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians 100% for the breakdown of negotiations, despite the fact that he promised that nobody would be to blame. So I relate this story because I think it's a good illustration that encapsulates the extent to which the United States is not an honest broker to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I can't explain this better than the actual participants on the U.S. side of this peace process have done so in writing themselves. So, for example, Dennis Ross, this was the key peace process player during the Bush years, during the Clinton years. He wrote a 900-page book about how he couldn't do his job. If I was a government official, I would not write a book about 900 pages of my failings, but he did. And of course, he didn't blame himself for his approach, but he blamed Yasser Arafat, as did Clinton. And in his book, what Ross says is that our MO was selling. He didn't refer to himself as a peacemaker or a negotiator or an honest broker or anything like that. He called himself a seller. And he said what we would do is we would take Israeli ideas or ideas that Israel could live with and work them over to make them more attractive to the Arabs, the undifferentiated mass of Arabs, as if we weren't talking specifically about Palestinians. We'd work these ideas over to make them more attractive to the Arabs and get the Arabs to scale back their expectations. Now, is this what an honest broker does? No, of course not. This is the superpower ganging up with the oppressor to try to ram down the throats of the oppressed an agreement that prejudices the oppressed's individual and national collective rights. Aaron David Miller, who was Ross's understudy in the Clinton years and his successor during part of the Bush II administration, he put it even more succinctly. He said, "We've acted as Israel's lawyers." This was in an op-ed in the Washington Post in 2005. And he said, "What we've done is we've catered to every Israeli whim at the expense of having successful negotiations." And he said something that I agree with, which is that if, and I think this is a huge if, because given our current political configuration, I don't think we can have an honest broker role to play in this conflict. I think we as a country are congenitally unprepared and unable to do so. But what Aaron David Miller said was that if we're going to be that broker, then we can have one client, and that client is not Israel. But that client has to be the requirements of a just and lasting peace. So as I wrote this book, I asked myself, did President Obama approach this issue from a different vantage point, from a different perspective, or did he continue this tradition of the United States acting as Israel's lawyers? And I came up with an equivocal answer. So let me give you the positives, and then I'll give you the negatives. Obama was fundamentally different than every single one of his predecessors on this issue because of his connections to the Palestinian American community, his understanding of the Palestinian narrative of suffering and dispossession at the hands of Israel, and his empathy for that narrative. There is no doubt that Barack Obama had all of these things going for him when he entered the White House. As a state senator in Chicago, his Hyde Park-based district included many Palestinian Americans. And it was a normal thing for him to attend community events, to go to the homes of prominent Palestinian academics in the district, like Professor Ashik Khalid, who at the time was at the University of Chicago, now at Columbia. And even to raise funds from this community. In fact, there's a very famous picture, which Obama probably wishes was not on the internet today, of him sitting down at a community function and talking intimately with the late Professor Edward Said. And so from these conversations, Obama developed an understanding of the Palestinian narrative that no other president had. And it was clear that he had a lot of empathy for the Palestinian narrative, because when he went to Cairo in June of 2009, he said as part of his speech of a new beginning approach to the Muslim world, that it is undeniable that Palestinians, Muslim and Christian alike, have suffered in pursuit of a homeland. And he talked about Palestinian refugees, languishing in refugee camps, unable to lead the life of peace and security that they deserve. And he talked about the daily humiliations that Palestinians endure under Israeli military occupation. No sitting U.S. president had ever said anything like this before while in office. Jimmy Carter has said similar things after he left office. But even while Jimmy Carter was in office, he never said anything remotely approaching this level of empathy with the Palestinians. Number two, Obama understood that appointing pro-Israel ideologues to be in charge of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations was like appointing an arsonist as your fire chief. And he broke with this U.S. tradition of appointing a pro-Israel ideologue to this position. And instead, he appointed the former Senate Majority Leader, George Mitchell. This was the same George Mitchell who in 1998 helped to broker an end to the conflict in Northern Ireland. This was the same George Mitchell who in 2001, at the height of the Second Palestinian Intifada, when Palestinians were demonized beyond belief in this country, Mitchell actually, at the behest of George W. Bush, went and did a fact-finding mission and came back with a report known as the Mitchell Report, which was actually, in the context, actually somewhat even-handed in terms of what it told Israel and the Palestinians they had to do to get back on track for a peace process. And as part of this Mitchell report, Mitchell said that Israel had to freeze its colonization of Palestinian lands, full stop, including the the so-called natural growth expansion of these settlements. So when Mitchell was appointed, the Israel lobby was furious, and they were very worried by this development. And on the other side, the Palestinian negotiating team was ecstatic over Mitchell's appointment. And the reason we know that is because of documents that were leaked from within the Palestinian negotiating team to Al Jazeera in 2011, I believe it was. And in these documents, you can see that the Palestinian negotiating team is taking notes on Mitchell's book on brokering peace in Northern Ireland. And what they're saying, after learning about Mitchell's negotiating style and his principles of conflict resolution, is that we might actually get a fair shake from the United States for the first time ever. Now, the third reason that Obama was different from his predecessors is because no president since Jimmy Carter had insisted so vehemently that Israel stop colonizing Palestinian land in order for there to be any hope of any peace between the sides. He was so insistent, and his administration was so insistent, that the first time the Israeli foreign minister came to Washington during the Obama administration, this is Avigdor Lieberman, who himself is a settler, he got up and he stood up at the State Department and he went on railing about, you can't tell us not to expand these settlements. We need to build new schools and new nurseries and new communal institutions and new synagogues and so on and so forth. You can't tell us not to lead our normal lives. And Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at the time, was right next to him and said no. When we say that you have to stop all settlement activities, that means all settlement activities. No more, not one more unit, not one more communal infrastructure, not one more community building, period. So if Obama really understood that Israel had to stop colonizing Palestinian land in order for there to be a credible peace process, and if he appointed someone who could have been an actual honest broker, and because he had this empathy and understanding of the Palestinian narrative, what happened? What went wrong? Why is the policy today in 2013 even worse than it was in 2009 when Obama entered the White House? I'll give you 3 reasons why I believe that that's the case. Number one, like every U.S. president since Richard Nixon, Obama increased military aid to Israel. Now, under international law, when you provide one side to a conflict weapons, you've broken the laws of neutrality. And you've declared that you are allied to the side that you are giving weapons to. It is not credible for the United States to claim that we are an honest broker when we are arming Israel to oppress the Palestinian people. This is obvious. Yet Obama continued this tradition of giving Israel more and more weapons. So when he entered, we gave Israel about $2.5 billion a year in weapons. Today, that figure is $3.1 billion. That's just in the direct military aid. There are other programs where the Pentagon and Israel coordinate on projects that are to Israel's benefit, and that is usually about another $500 million or so per year. So we're really talking about $3.5 billion. And it's obvious to anyone who follows politics that there is no love lost between Obama and the current Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. In fact, some of you may remember an international conference, I think it was in 2011, that Obama attended, and he was talking with the French Premier, Nicolas Sarkozy, and they didn't realize that their mics were on. And Sarkozy says, "Can you believe this asshole Netanyahu?" And Obama says, "Well, at least you don't have to deal with him like I do every single day." And this was picked up on the mics, and it was a big incident in the media. But, you know, so that's just to illustrate that there's no love lost between them on a personal level. In fact, they probably hate each other. But what Israeli politicians and American politicians all agree upon is that under Obama, The military ties have never been closer. The military coordination has never been closer. And the military aid has never been greater. And to make matters worse, when Obama went to Jerusalem in March, he stood up to an audience of Israeli college students in Jerusalem, and he said, I want to extend U.S. military aid to Israel. So George W. Bush signed an agreement to give Israel $30 billion of our taxes in weapons to Israel from 2009 to 2018. Obama said, I can do one better. So what he's talking about is cutting a deal with Israel during the second term in office to provide $40 billion of additional weapons to Israel all the way to 2028. This is at a time of sequestration, when we've seen across-the-board budget cuts to every single issue here in the United States. How is it possible that we don't have money for healthcare, we don't have money for infrastructure, we don't have money for green jobs, we don't have money to take care of the basic necessities of people in this country, and we have $40 billion to give in weapons to Israel to oppress the Palestinian people? This is Obama's policy. 2, like other U.S. presidents who have faced pressure from the Israel lobby, Obama folded to that pressure. He didn't stand up and try to challenge it. He didn't take his case to the public. Instead, when faced with blowback from the Israel lobby, he capitulated to it. And this happened very clearly and very early in his presidency. It happened in May of 2009, right after he and his administration had issued the most forceful condemnations of Israeli settlement activity. And so what happened was the American Israel Public Affairs Committee mobilized 3/4 of the Senate to send Obama a letter to undermine his foreign policy. A letter which basically said, stop criticizing Israel like this in public. And from this letter and from this pressure from the Israel lobby, Obama chose not to fight. And he chose to capitulate to this pressure. And he did so by taking this character, Dennis Ross, the one who referred to his job in the Clinton and Bush administrations as selling Israeli ideas to the Palestinians. He took him and he moved him to the National Security Council inside the White House and put him on this perch right next to him. And what he told Dennis Ross was that from now on, you're going to be my quarterback on all Middle East issues. And what Ross told Obama was, thank you, Mr. President, because the problem with your administration is that you've been focused on this one issue of Israeli settlements when it's not really that big of a deal. And so, from this perch at the National Security Council, Dennis Ross systematically undermined George Mitchell, who was the nominal special envoy for Middle East peace. And he prevented him from acting as the honest broker that he could have been. And Mitchell got so frustrated by this, you all remember perhaps Obama's speech at the State Department in 2011 on the Arab Spring. After this, Mitchell got so frustrated that he resigned without having achieved anything more than a 3-week relaunch of negotiations that went nowhere in 2010. Now, the third reason why Obama was the same, if not worse, than his predecessors is that because, like other U.S. administrations, he used the diplomatic clout and the power of the United States to prevent Israel from being held accountable in the international arena. Make no mistake about it, it's only because of U.S. diplomatic support at the UN that Israel is allowed to continue to grossly violate dozens of Security Council resolutions, violate basic premises of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which govern how you need to behave in a situation of military occupation, and to continue to commit war crimes against the Palestinian people. So most importantly, and this is revealed quite explicitly through WikiLeaks, is that the United States conspired to be complicit with Israel in killing the Goldstone Report. And for those of you who may not have heard of the Goldstone Report, this was commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council after Israel's devastating assault on the Gaza Strip in December of 2008 and January of 2009, which massacred more than 1,400 Palestinians. And this Goldstone Report, in 575 pages of heartbreaking detail, documented exactly how both Israel and Palestinian militant groups, for that matter, Goldstone insisted that he cover both, by the way, although the United States would claim otherwise, documented in excruciating detail that Israel had committed human rights violations, violations of international law, war crimes, and even potential crimes against humanity during this attack on Gaza. And as the Goldstone Report was coming out, Obama was winning his Nobel Peace Prize. For what? I don't exactly know. But as Obama got his Nobel Peace Prize, he was at the same time conspiring to undermine and kill this Goldstone Report and to make sure that Israel was not held accountable for its war crimes. Now, if you're going to win the Nobel Peace Prize, you better have the principles to stand up and to say, I believe in the principles of this Nobel Peace Prize, and I am going to act to ensure that anybody who perpetrates war crimes is held accountable. Because to do otherwise violates the whole entire spirit of the Nobel Peace Prize to begin with. But through WikiLeaks, we see a very different story emerging. We see the Obama administration sending out what's called an all embassies cable. That's a directive to every single U.S. diplomatic installation around the globe. And in this cable, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton lays out talking points for how U.S. ambassadors should address their host country's government at the highest level possible, preferably talking to their heads of state, to try to convince them to vote against the Goldstone Report at the UN. And one of these talking points, there are many terrible talking points in this memo, but one terrible one in particular is that if Israel is held accountable for its war crimes, this will damage the prospects for peace. It's not the fact that Israel is committing these war crimes that's the problem in the Obama administration's eyes. It's that Israel may be held accountable for the war crimes that's problematic. And so the Obama administration proceeded to deploy its substantial diplomatic capabilities to defeat this proposal, to make sure that it never got to the Security Council, never got to the International Criminal Court, and to make sure that Israel literally got away with murder. And the Obama administration actually argued that Israel was perfectly capable of holding itself accountable for any war crimes documented in the Goldstone Report. This, despite the fact, as I write in the book, that the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem found that, I think it was in 95% plus cases of them having brought charges against Israeli soldiers for violations of human rights, they weren't even prosecuted, much less convicted. So how could Israel be expected to hold itself accountable with this kind of record of impunity? Yet the Obama administration argued this with a straight face. And there's another cable from WikiLeaks of a memo of a conversation between the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, and the Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister, Dani Ayalon. And in this cable, Rice is quoted as saying that she wanted to thank the Israeli mission to Geneva, where the UN Human Rights Council is based, for its outstanding cooperation with the United States to, quote, blunt the effects of the Goldstone Report. So make no mistake about it, the United States acts to ensure that Israel is never held accountable for its war crimes, and this is what Obama continued. And you see this behavior time and time again, whether we're talking about the Gaza Freedom Flotilla in 2010. This, to me, blows my mind because Israel killed 9 Turkish civilians in international waters, including 1 American citizen, for Kandoan. 18 years old, shot 5 times. 3 or 4 of those shots were at point-blank range while he was on the floor. He was assassinated. Did the Obama administration demand justice for Israel's killing of a U.S. citizen? No. They did the same exact thing. Through documents that were released through a Freedom of Information Act request by the Center for Constitutional Rights, the exact same pattern emerges of the United States working hand in glove with Israel to make sure that no investigation and no accountability took place. To make matters even worse, the United States actually threatened U.S. citizens, get this, they threatened U.S. citizens with prosecution under anti-terrorism laws if they attempted to deliver wheelchairs to the besieged people of the Gaza Strip. This is the Obama administration's extent to which it has protected Israel in the international arena. Same thing happened with the vetoing of the Security Council resolution in 2011, condemning Israeli settlement building activity. Same thing happened with the U.S.'s successful efforts to defeat Palestine from becoming a member of the UN in 2011. So where are we today? Has Obama's policies gotten better in their second term? Some people would argue that if you get reelected to the presidency, then you're somehow unconstrained from the lobbying powers that present such narrow policy opportunities and options in our country. Well, I think Obama is actually worse in this second term than in his first term. And that's for 2 reasons. Number one, gone is any pretense of the United States trying to stop Israel's colonization of Palestinian land. We don't even have a pretense of caring anymore. So John Kerry, the current Secretary of State, says in August of this year, after negotiations resumed in July, when asked a question about this from a journalist about whether Israel would continue to be announcing the expansion of settlements during these negotiations, John Kerry said, yes, we understand that Israel will be continuing to announce settlement expansion during these talks, but we don't want that to be an obstacle to their success. So again, it's not the fact that Israel's colonizing Palestinian land that's the problem. The problem would be to let that be an obstacle to the success of the negotiations. Also, in his second term, Obama has returned to this terrible U.S. policy of appointing a pro-Israel ideologue to shepherd Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. The current holder of this position is a fellow by the name of Martin Indyk. Before he worked for the U.S. government, Martin Indyk was in the employ of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. This is why Yasser Abdurabu, one of the senior Palestinian negotiators, said last month that these negotiations are futile. Because what is Israel offering in these negotiations? According to details that were leaked by the Palestinian negotiating team to the AP, what Israel is proposing is that it will not uproot one of its 150 illegal colonies in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It will keep all 650,000 Israeli settlers in place where they are. It will keep all the infrastructure of military occupation and apartheid roads and apartheid walls exactly where they are. Israel will continue its ethnic cleansing process in the Jordan Valley and keep a permanent buffer between the West Bank and Jordan. In other words, what Israel proposes to do is to turn the West Bank into what Gaza is today, an open-air prison that's besieged and beleaguered and completely under the control of Israel. Now, this is obviously a non-starter for the Palestinian negotiating team, And this is why these negotiations will break down in failure. And to me, it seems that the only people who are benefiting from the existence of this, quote, peace process is Israel. Because what is standing between the Israel of today, which for some reason the United States insists on believing is a democracy, and the Israel of tomorrow, which will become the equivalent, the 21st century equivalent of the international pariah that South Africa became in the 20th century. The thing that's holding up that development is the existence of this peace process. It is the glue that's keeping this whole charade together. And as soon as this finally collapses, Israel has no more talking points with which to defend its abominable apartheid policies toward the Palestinian people. And the day will be hastened when Israel becomes the international pariah that it should be. So where does that leave us? Is everyone here involved with SJP or not everyone? Most people? If you're not involved with SJP, please get involved with SJP on campus. And please support SJP's efforts to once again pass a divestment resolution at UC Riverside, because as I understood from what happened last year, a resolution was passed by the Student Senate and the Israel lobby came in and twisted some arms and got it revoked. So we'll try again this year, and we'll get it passed again this year, and hopefully it'll stick. And hopefully eventually the UC regents will divest from corporations that are supporting Israel's apartheid policies toward the Palestinian people. This is the way forward. This is the way that we are going to bring about a just and lasting peace. Not by trusting in the politicians, but by doing the exact same thing that brought an end to apartheid in South Africa. And the fact is that we're winning. And Israel and its supporters are scared. That's why they didn't come out tonight. They don't want to debate, because they can't debate anymore. Israel cannot stand on its merits. Israel has no more arguments for its policies toward the Palestinian people. Right now, it's all about arm twisting. It's all about repressing the debate from even happening, because they know that they cannot win that debate. And so what we're doing by divesting is we're pulling out the pieces of the infrastructure that support Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people in the United States. And this is the wonderful thing about social change. As bleak as things may seem on the ground, and they are incredibly bleak, I was just there in June, you never know when that change is going to happen. You keep on doing the work in the faith and in the hope and in the knowledge that eventually justice will prevail. It doesn't always prevail, but it often does. So every activist who I talked to who is involved in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, they all said to me, every single one, Josh, we never thought we would see an end to apartheid in South Africa in our lifetime. And they didn't believe it was going to happen until the day that de Klerk announced that he was going to have negotiations with the ANC to end apartheid. So we don't know when that moment is going to happen, but I don't think it's going to be very long. I don't think Israeli apartheid policies can be sustained much longer, and with your dedication, with your commitment to peace and justice, we will make that happen. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll start. Go ahead.
So you're speaking about the peace process and it eventually collapsing.
Yeah.
And I wrote this down. So from the U.S. foreign policy position, so what is it going to take for this to collapse? And I know this sounds far-fetched, but what does it take from the U.S. foreign policy position for it to collapse from that end? Mm-hmm. And then as far as the Palestinians are concerned, and by Palestinians I don't mean the PA,
yeah.
What can we do, or what is it going to take from us for that peace process to collapse? Palestinians, not only in Palestine, but everywhere.
Yeah, good question. I think the peace process is going to collapse on its own weight. I mean, even John Kerry said in testimony to the Senate 6 months ago that there remains a 1-year window for a two-state resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's why he set spring of 2014 is the deadline for these negotiations to succeed. Of course, they're not going to. So I think even amongst official U.S. policy, there's a recognition that we're at the end of a paradigm. We're at the end of an era. And obviously I don't have a crystal ball, but I think what's going to happen is that Obama will say after this latest round collapses, I tried my best, I'm punting this to the next president, deal with it. He's going to do exactly what Mitt Romney accused him of doing on the campaign trail, of kicking the can down the road. With that, I agree with Romney. So I don't think much more has to be done. I think this peace process is just about buried. You know, what can Palestinians do? I'm always kind of like loath as a non-Palestinian
so
to.
we already act on it because for a lot of us it doesn't exist.
What doesn't
The
exist?
peace process.
Oh,
So
yeah, of course.
I don't identify with it. A lot of the people here probably don't identify with it or recognize it. So we act as if it doesn't exist anyways.
Yeah.
So that's,
Yeah, I mean, I think the best response is just to be a strong voice and a strong advocate backing the Palestinian civil society call for BDS. I think that's honestly the most effective thing that not only Palestinians, but everyone concerned about this issue can do at this point, especially if we're talking about on a college campus. So it's quite a bunch. Yes, please.
Do you wish there were opponents to what we're discussing here? Do you wish that there were some people in the audience that want to have the debate that you mentioned is worth not having?
Yeah, I wish there were, because, you know, when opponents do come out, they think that they have a tough question to answer. So I've gotten one of these. I want to ask you a tough question so far on this book tour, and I think I've done about 24 events so far, and it came at Harvard. And you know how Israel is like now paying Israeli students to be like paid propagandists on campus. So I'm pretty sure that this fellow was one of those people. And so he's like, I have a tough question for you. I said, okay, go ahead, ask me. He said, I believe that Israel should be a Jewish and democratic state, and what you're saying about peace process, two states being not viable, a one-state solution, and all this stuff. And so that, you know, that was the extent of his tough question, which I kind of thought was a bit of a softball. So, I mean, I think it really goes to show that, you know, Israel's supporters are just really out of rationale, out of arguments, out of energy to try to argue Israel's case anymore. Now it's all about, oh, Israel is such a progressive society. Women can go in bikinis to the beaches of Tel Aviv. We have gay parades in Tel Aviv, and you know, all this pinkwashing that Israel is trying to do to buttress its image. You know, it can try all it wants to say that, and yeah, those things are true. But it doesn't take away from the fact that Israel's still oppressing the Palestinian people. I mean, look, white South Africans could go to the beach in bikinis too, as well, under apartheid. So what? Yes, please.
What's the discourse the Obama administration currently gives for giving a hunk a load of money to Israel for the military?
Let me do my best administration impersonation. Israel is our unshakable, unbreakable ally, and we will never abandon Israel's security. You know, that's what the talking point is. The reality of this policy being the way it is because this is always the top lobbying agenda for AIPAC. When they go to Washington, they bring 10,000 citizen lobbyists. Their number one ask is always for more weapons to Israel. And of course, it also benefits the U.S. weapons industry because they get 75% of this appropriation. Israel is the only country in the world which gets military aid and can actually spend it on its own military industry. Israel can spend up to 25% of this U.S. money on its own weapons makers. All other countries have to spend 100% on U.S. weapons manufacturers. But it's still a big bonus to U.S. weapons manufacturers. Israel gets about 60% of all U.S. military aid. So it gets more than all other 192, 93. Oh, we've got South Sudan now. No, 192 others, countries combined.
Follow.
Yeah.
Does Israel get the most money on military aid
Military aid, yeah.
than any other country in the world?
All other countries combined.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, all other countries combined. They get more than 3 billion. The rest of the world gets about 2 billion. With Egypt getting most of that. Although not anymore, since most of that just got suspended. Yeah, please.
I have a comment. I think the first thing we have to do is understand what the peace process is.
Yeah.
It's not about peace, it's
Right.
a process designed for Israel to keep as much as Palestine as they can.
Yeah.
And with less and less Palestinians as possible. So it's never been about peace process since the last 10 years.
Agree.
Oslo started. The other one is, I think we should not focus too much on Obama.
Yeah.
It's just responding to the political pressure he's subjected to.
Right.
Like you said, he was very sympathetic to the Palestinian community when he used to live in Chicago. And I've talked to people who know in Chicago, and he actually started his politics
Right.
in Palestinian circle. But in America, when you climb up the political ladder, it's a social price that you have to pay. You have to put the Muslim and the Arab and the Palestinian community aside to rise up in the political ladder. So I think that's what he did, and he's responding to the pressure he's subjected to. So the problem is not Obama per se, but the problem is the political scene that the United States cannot be an honest with.
Totally agree, 100%. You could have given the first part of my talk.
I can't.
No worries. Good reinforcement. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, let's, 1, 2. Take them both. Okay, whoever first.
Okay, do you think that there's any hope for the UN? Because you said earlier that the United States is constantly vetoing,
Yeah.
and it has a lot of power in the UN. Do you think there's any hope to take the case to the UN and actually get something moved forward?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as a student activist, as someone who not only on this campus but at several other university campuses partakes in whatever this type of activism is, I see a lot of apathy. I mean,
Yeah.
people whose parents were part of their activist scene back in whatever their contemporary time in the 70s, 80s, the 90s, and they become very, very disenchanted, I guess is the word.
Yeah.
They've lost faith in any hope of a solution, anything like that. So my question to you is, as a DC-based activist, what have you seen in DC and across the country that can counter these sentiments, that we can take back to our apathetic peers to
Yeah.
kind of help?
Yeah, good question. If the UN didn't have to worry about the United States undermining it, yeah, of course, the UN would have long ago been able to broker Israeli-Palestinian peace, undoubtedly. They, as I argue in my book, they are the more neutral players. They are the ones that are basing their policies on international law, on human rights, on concepts of equality, whereas the U.S. is basing it on continued Israeli apartheid. So yes, they would be much better placed to broker an end to this conflict. But because of the predominant power that the U.S. has in the UN, they're simply not allowed to, because the U.S. is Israel's backstop at the UN. So for as long as that situation obtains, and as long as we have an undemocratic United Nations, where 5 countries can decide to veto something that the rest of the international community agrees upon, that policy is not likely to change. The one potential game changer is that if Palestine decides to join the International Criminal Court, this the United States cannot prevent. So this is what the Palestinian bid for UN membership was really all about. It was about getting the status to enable them to join the International Criminal Court. Now that they're recognized as of last year as what's called a non-member permanent state, something like that, many legal experts believe that they now have the legal competency and standing to join the International Criminal Court. And this greatly concerns Israel and the United States because if Palestine becomes a member of the ICC, then they can bring criminal lawsuits against Israeli military and political leaders, and there's nothing Israel or the United States can do. So can you imagine how dramatically different the situation would be if Benjamin Netanyahu were in the same position as President Bashir of Sudan, indicted by the International Criminal Court? He would be viewed as an international criminal. So this is what Israel greatly fears. And the United States, as I documented in the book, twisted Palestinians' arm tremendously to try to defeat going to the ICC. And this was a condition, this is another reason for these sham peace process negotiations, is that, right, remember Kerry said, Israel, don't worry, you can go ahead and keep colonizing Palestinian land. But what he said to the Palestinians is, when you come to the table, you have to say that you're not going to the ICC for as long as these negotiations take place, right? So the Palestinians can't use the weapons in their arsenal. But of course, Israel is free to continue its colonization. So that's one potential game changer. When these negotiations break down by the spring of 2014 at the latest, Palestinians may reevaluate their options and may decide to go to the ICC. But there's nothing legally stopping them from becoming a member right now and having a real game-changing situation. How do we empower the disenchanted? I think it's easier now than at any other point in history. I mean, look at the tremendous victories that are taking place today. Palestinians, Palestinian Americans, people who support Palestinian human rights have more access to the mainstream media than ever before. There's been a dramatic change over the last 5 years. And I go through how this process has affected the mainstream discourse on this issue. We're winning victories on college campuses. We've gotten Veolia, which profiteers from Israeli military occupation by running segregated bus lines and the tram system that's connecting up settlements in Jerusalem and doing waste management projects for settlements. We, meaning the International Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, has cost Veolia billions of dollars in contracts lost because of their association with these Israeli projects. We've seen mainstream church denominations like the United Methodist and the Presbyterian Church pass resolutions to boycott Israeli settlement products and calling for an end to U.S. aid to Israel. We've seen 15 church leaders send a letter to Congress demanding that they follow U.S. law and investigate Israel's violations of the Arms Export Control Act and hold it accountable for the weapons that they're misusing against Palestinians. So all of these, I think, are very dramatic developments. I was up at the Griffith Observatory in LA on Thursday. Have you all been there? Have you seen that pendulum exhibit that they have? They have a pendulum exhibit, so obviously we can't feel ourselves moving the earth, right? We don't feel the earth is moving. We feel that it's stationary. But they have this exhibit that is set up there that shows the pendulum is suspended, from above. And the pendulum swings, the pendulum doesn't move. But the floor, you see around it moving, and they set up pegs, right, to show that indeed the floor is moving because this pendulum swinging in the same direction keeps knocking over different pegs. And that's kind of like how it is with social change. If you look at it from a very static perspective, you can say, oh, today things are looking worse. Israel demolished another home. Israel expelled villagers from another Palestinian village. And yes, all of that is true, but when you step back and look at things, the ground is really moving under our feet, and we're making it move. So I've been doing this work for like 15 years now, and I've never had more optimism than I have today. And I'm not just saying that to try to, empower people. I really believe that. Trust me, there have been times doing this work where I've been very despondent myself and felt that nothing will ever change and that I'm just doing this because it's the right thing to do. I really don't believe that. I really believe that we're winning and we're going to win. And I don't think it's going to take that much longer. Well, if there are no more questions, then I hope you'll pick up a copy of my book. And like I said, I'm selling it for the uber low price of $15 for students tonight. I apologize it's not out in paperback yet, but it just came out last month. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, SJP, for hosting me.
Of course.
And